They say the stars weep when a space marine falls, not in grief but in warning, because what comes after the fall is far worse than death. Deep in the archives of the Ordo Hereticus, there exists a classification that technically doesn't exist. No official designation, no approved protocol, just a black mark in a ledger that vanishes the moment anyone looks too closely. The Inquisition calls it Whisper Protocol, though even saying those words aloud in certain chambers is enough to warrant immediate execution. Not because the protocol itself is heretical, but because of what it contains. The voices of the fallen, not their memories, not their confessions. Their voices still speaking, still coherent, still claiming to serve the Emperor, long after their bodies have been reduced to ash and their names have been struck from every record in the Imperium. The first documented case occurred during the cleansing of Galax Prime in the 38th millennium. An entire company of Crimson Fists had been declared excommunicate, atratoris, after reports surfaced of them butchering Imperial Guard regiments without provocation. The chapter itself disowned them. The Inquisition moved swiftly. Execution was meant to be absolute. But 3 days after the Loyalist forces burned the last traitor Marine to nothing but molten ceramite and bone dust, something impossible happened. A Vox transmission cut through every channel on the planet simultaneously. It was one of the executed Marines, his voice unmistakable, calm, rational. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't raging. He was explaining. He spoke for 17 minutes before the transmission ended. Every word was recorded, though the recordings were immediately seized by inquisitorial forces and classified under a seal that required 3 separate Inquisitor Lords to access. What he said in those 17 minutes has never been officially disclosed, but the few fragments that leaked painted a picture more disturbing than any demonic corruption or chaos taint. He claimed he had seen the Emperor, not a vision. It's not a warp-spawn delusion. The Emperor himself standing before him in the Imperium, flesh and blood, speaking words that contradicted everything the ecclesiarchy preached. Words that made the Marine turn his bolter on those he once called brothers. The Inquisition declared it a hoax, a warp echo, psychic afterimage of a corrupted mind trying to justify its betrayal even in death. But then it happened again and again. Different worlds, different chapters, different circumstances. Always the same pattern. Marines fall. Marines are executed. Marines speak from beyond their deaths, calm and collected, claiming divine instruction, claiming they saw something that changed everything. And every single time, the Inquisition arrives, burns the recordings, executes anyone who heard too much, and pretends it never happened. But whispers don't burn, not really. They spread through the Imperium like cracks in ancient stone, small enough to ignore until the entire structure begins to shift. There are those within the Inquisition itself who have begun asking questions that border on suicidal curiosity. Why do these Marines all describe the same figure? Why do their accounts align so precisely when they had no contact with each other? Why do some of them speak of future events that later come to pass with unsettling accuracy? Most dangerous of all, why do their final words always end the same way? With a warning, spoken not as a threat, but as a desperate plea. They tell those listening to look closer at the Imperium, to question what they've been told, to ask themselves why 10,000 years of loyalty have led to nothing but an endless ocean of suffering and decay. The Ordo Hereticus has a standard procedure for handling these incidents now. Containment teams arrive within hours. Entire populations are mind-scrubbed or liquidated if necessary. Tech priests are brought in to purge every data core, every cogitator, every scrap of recorded sound. The fallen Marines are not just killed, they are unmade. Erased so thoroughly that even speaking their names becomes impossible because no one remembers what those names were. But the Inquisition has learned something terrifying over the centuries of enforcing this silence. The voices are not getting quieter, they're getting clearer, more coherent, more insistent. There's a theory, never spoken aloud but understood by those who have seen too many of these cases, that something is trying to communicate through the fallen. Something vast and patient and utterly incomprehensible to mortal minds. Some believe it's the Emperor himself, reaching out through the only souls pure enough to hear him, trying to deliver a message the Imperium refuses to receive. Others think it's something far older, something that existed before the Imperium, before humanity even crawled out of old Earth's oceans. A truth so fundamental and so shattering that even hearing it secondhand is enough to break a person's faith entirely. The most disturbing aspect isn't the voices themselves, It's what happens to those who listen too long. Inquisitors who spend years investigating Whisper Protocol cases begin to change. Not corruption, not mutation, just a slow, creeping transformation in how they see the Imperium. They start questioning orders. They start filing reports that get them flagged for observation. They start looking at the Golden Throne not with reverence, but with something that looks disturbingly like pity. And eventually, they vanish, reassigned to distant war zones. Lost in warp travel, found dead under circumstances that conveniently prevent any investigation. The Inquisition doesn't just hunt heretics. It hunts those who listen to heretics too carefully, because sometimes the most dangerous corruption isn't the one that turns you into a monster. It's the one that makes you wonder if the monsters were right all along. On a forgotten shrine world in the Segmentum Obscurus, there's a vault that officially doesn't exist. Inside that vault are 3,217 recordings. Every single Whisper Protocol case ever documented, preserved not as evidence, but as warning. Once every decade, a council of Inquisitor Lords convenes in absolute secrecy to review them, searching for patterns, searching for answers, searching for any way to stop what's coming. Because they've noticed something that keeps them awake during whatever few hours they allow themselves to sleep. The intervals between cases are shrinking. What once happened every few years now happens every few months. The voices are no longer isolated incidents. They're becoming a chorus. And in the last recording, made just 3 months ago from a Black Templar's crusade fleet that was subsequently declared lost to warp storms, the fallen Marines said something that made even the most hardened Inquisitor Lords go silent. He said the Whispers aren't a warning anymore. They're an invitation. The invitation was simple. Just coordinates. A location in the Halo stars where no Imperial vessel had traveled in recorded history. The fallen Templar, his voice steady despite describing his own imminent execution, said that others would come, that they were already gathering, that the Emperor had shown him brothers from 100 different chapters, all drawn to the same point in space, all carrying the same burden of impossible knowledge. He said they would wait there until someone brave enough, or desperate enough, came looking for answers that the Imperium had spent 10 millennia trying to bury. The Inquisition did what it always does. It erased the coordinates from every database. It executed every crew member who heard the transmission, declared the entire Black Templars fleet excommunicate, and sent 3 battle groups to hunt down any survivors. But coordinates are just numbers, and numbers have a way of surviving when they matter. Someone always remembers. Someone always writes them down in a place no one thinks to look. And in an Imperium spanning 1,000,000 worlds, there are always those desperate enough to go searching for truths that might kill them. Lord Inquisitor Erasmus Kade was not supposed to be one of those people. 70 years in the Ordo Hereticus had carved him into exactly what the Imperium needed. A man capable of ordering the deaths of billions without hesitation, if it meant preserving the faith. He had overseen the purging of 14 entire worlds. He'd personally executed 7 fellow Inquisitors for suspected corruption. His faith in the Emperor was not a comfort. It was a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. But 3 years ago, Kade made a mistake. He'd listened to one of the recordings for too long. It wasn't intentional. A routine investigation into a suspected Whisper Protocol case on a Forge world in the Calix's sector. The recording had been corrupted, fragmented, only pieces remaining in a damaged cogitator core. Kade thought he could extract information without truly hearing what was being said. It was wrong. The voice belonged to a librarian from the Storm Wardens, a psyker who had been executed for divination heresy after predicting the fall of an entire subsector with terrifying accuracy. The prediction had been dismissed as warp-taint madness. Then, 6 months later, everything the librarian described came to pass exactly as he said it would. The subsector burned. 4 billion souls lost. And in the recording, the librarian wasn't ranting or weeping. He was apologizing for not making them understand sooner, apologizing for failing to find the right words to make them see what he had seen when the Emperor touched his mind. Kade had heard thousands of heretics justify their betrayals. He'd developed an immunity to their words, their logic, their desperate attempts to make damnation sound like salvation. But this was different. The librarian spoke with the cadence of a man who had already accepted his death and moved beyond fear into something that looked disturbingly like peace. He described the Emperor not as a god, not as a corpse on a throne, but as something actively suffering, actively reaching out, actively trying to communicate through the only channels still open to him. the souls of those who had fallen so far from the Imperium's doctrine that they could finally hear him clearly. He said the Emperor was screaming, had been screaming for 10,000 years, and the Imperium had built its entire faith structure on pretending not to hear. Kade ordered the recording destroyed immediately. He purged his own memories using sanctioned psychic techniques, filed his report, and moved on to the next case. But something changed in him during those 17 minutes of listening. A seed of doubt that should have withered in the harsh light of his faith instead began to grow in the darkness of questions he couldn't quite silence. He started noticing patterns in cases he'd dismissed before. He started seeing connections the Inquisition officially denied existed. And slowly, carefully, over 3 years of meticulous investigation that he hid even from his own staff, Kade began assembling something that terrified him more than any demon he'd ever faced. Evidence that the Whisper Protocol cases weren't random. They were targeted, specific, and they were increasing in frequency because something was running out of time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A Lex mechanic on Mars who had been cataloging ancient pre-heresy records discovered a fragment of a transmission dating back to the days immediately following the Emperor's entombment on the Golden Throne. The fragment had been misfiled, labeled as corrupted data, ignored for 10 millennia. But when properly decoded, it revealed a short message from Malcador, the Sigillite himself, sealed under his personal encryption and addressed to someone whose name had been redacted from all records. The message was brief. The Emperor can still speak, but the throne filters his words through layers of ritual and dogma that render them unrecognizable. Only those outside the system can hear him clearly now. We have failed him. We've built a prison of faith and called it salvation. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and the Imperium has likely spent centuries proving me right. Do not stop listening for his voice. It will come through the most unexpected channels, and it will sound like heresy because truth always does to those who profit from lies. The Lex mechanic died in an industrial accident 3 days after making the discovery. Fragment was seized and classified. But Kade had already obtained a copy through channels that would get him executed if discovered. He spent 2 months verifying its authenticity, using every resource at his disposal while maintaining the facade of routine inquisitorial business. Every test confirmed what he already knew in his bones. The message was genuine. Malcador himself, the Emperor's closest confidant, had known, had tried to warn someone, died knowing that the Imperium would bury the truth so deep that even thinking about it became heresy. Kade made a decision that would have horrified the man he'd been 4 years ago. He started searching for the coordinates, not to destroy them, to follow them. He assembled a small team, 6 individuals chosen not for their loyalty to the Imperium, but for their capacity to question it. A navigator who'd seen something in the warp that the novice Nobilite wanted erased from her memory, or a battle sister who'd survived an entire convent being declared heretical and still couldn't understand why. A tech priest who'd touched a pre-heresy AI and walked away with questions that nearly got him lobotomized. A rogue trader who'd found human civilizations thriving in the dark beyond Imperial space. Civilizations that had never heard of the Emperor and seemed happier for it. A sanctioned psyker who claimed to hear a voice in his dreams that called itself by a name that was forbidden to speak. And a former space marine, chapter redacted, who'd been betrayed by his own brothers for asking why 10,000 years of war had brought nothing but more war. They left Imperial space quietly, using forged documents and falsified route plans that would buy them maybe 6 months before anyone noticed. The navigator set course for coordinates that officially didn't exist, steering them through warp currents that felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate, as if the Imperium itself was guiding them toward something it desperately needed them to find. The journey took 4 months of subjective time, though when they finally translated back to real space, the chronometers insisted only 3 days had passed. Time fractures in the halo stars. Reality becomes negotiable. What they found wasn't a fleet of fallen marines. It wasn't some grand revelation floating in the void. It was a station, ancient pre-Imperium, possibly pre-human. A massive ring structure orbiting nothing, hanging in the darkness between stars like a monument to something the universe had forgotten. And on every surface, carved in languages that shouldn't exist, repeated across kilometers of alien metal, was a single phrase. The cogitator cores eventually translated it, though the tech priest insisted the translation was imperfect, that the actual meaning was something human cognition wasn't equipped to fully process. But the simplified version made Kade's blood turn cold. The Emperor is not what you think he is. He never was, and he has been trying to tell you since the moment he sat upon the throne. The station was empty. No fallen Marines waiting with answers. No ancient custodian ready to dispense forbidden wisdom. Just the message, repeated endlessly in one active terminal at the station's core. When Kade accessed it, using command codes that he somehow already knew, despite never having seen them before, the terminal activated. A single data packet downloaded directly into his neural implants before the terminal died. The sensation was like swallowing broken glass made of light. And suddenly, Kade understood why the Inquisition burned these cases so thoroughly, why they executed anyone who listened too long, why they had built an entire subsection of their organization around enforcing a silence that violated everything they claimed to stand for. The fallen Marines weren't traitors, they were witnesses. And what they witnessed wasn't corruption or heresy or even truth in the way the Imperium understood it. They saw the Emperor as he actually was, stripped of 10,000 years of worship and mythology and desperate human need for salvation. They saw what he had been trying to become before the throne interrupted his transformation. They saw what he was still trying to do from inside his golden prison, fighting against the very faith that powered him because that faith was killing him more surely than Horus ever could have. And they fell not because they rejected him, but because they finally understood him. Because understanding the Emperor meant understanding that everything the Imperium had become was the exact opposite of what he wanted. That every prayer strengthened his cage. That every war in his name drove the galaxy further from the future he'd tried to build. That humanity's salvation required something the Imperium could never provide: the willingness to let the Emperor die. Kade stood frozen in the command chamber of the station, his hand still resting on the terminal that had just died. The data packet burned in his mind like a brand, not painful, but undeniable. A presence that had taken up residence in his thoughts and refused to be ignored. Around him, his team waited in silence, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of emergency lumens that flickered across surfaces covered in alien script. The battle sister, whose name was Constance, had her hand on her bolter, though Kade suspected she didn't even realize it. The gesture was automatic now, a prayer written in the language of violence. But her eyes betrayed something he'd never seen in a sister of battle before. Uncertainty, not about her faith in the Emperor, but about what that faith actually meant. The rogue traitor Vex was the first to speak. His voice echoed strangely in the chamber, as if the station itself was listening. He asked the question they were all thinking, but none of them wanted to voice. If what the terminal showed them was true, if the Emperor actually wanted to die, then what were they supposed to do with that knowledge? How do you serve a god who has been begging for release for 10,000 years? How do you remain loyal to an Imperium that exists solely to prevent the one thing its master desires? Kade found his voice, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. He told them what he'd seen in the data packet, speaking slowly, carefully, as if each word might detonate something fragile in the air between them. The Emperor, he explained, had not intended to sit upon the golden throne forever. It was meant to be temporary, a sacrifice lasting perhaps decades, maybe a century at most, while humanity stabilized and learned to stand without him. But the Imperium had other plans. They couldn't let him go, couldn't imagine an existence without their master, their god, their perfect excuse for every atrocity committed in his name. So they fed him souls. 10,000 psychers a day. An ocean of human lives poured into a machine designed to keep one man alive against his will. And the Emperor, locked in his prison of flesh and gold and desperate human faith, could do nothing but scream silently into the warp, hoping someone, anyone, would finally understand what he'd been trying to say since the moment Horus struck him down. The Emperor wanted humanity to grow up, to stop worshipping him, to build something better than an empire sustained by endless war and casual genocide. But every prayer strengthened the cage. Every battlefield hymn added another chain. Every child taught to revere his name pushed the galaxy one step further from the future he'd envisioned. The fallen Marines had seen this truth, and it had broken them. Not because they lost faith in the Emperor, but because they gained it. Real faith. The kind that demands you actually listen to what your God is telling you, even when those words condemn everything you've built in his name. The sanctioned psyker, a hollow-eyed man named Silas who rarely spoke, finally broke his silence. He said he'd been hearing the Emperor's voice for 3 years, ever since he'd survived a possession that should have killed him. The voice didn't speak in words, not exactly, but in feelings, impressions, vast emotional landscapes that human language couldn't quite capture. And the dominant emotion wasn't rage, or disappointment, or even sorrow. It was exhaustion. The Emperor was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of watching humanity tear itself apart in his name. Tired of being worshipped by an empire that had forgotten every lesson he'd tried to teach. Silas said the voice in his dreams always ended the same way, with a plea that sounded like a father begging his children to finally let him rest. Constance turned away, her armor scraping against the alien metal floor. When she spoke, her voice was tight, controlled, barely containing something that might have been fury or grief or both. She said that everything she'd done, every heretic she'd burned, every world she'd helped bring to compliance, every prayer she'd offered as her sisters died around her, all of it was supposed to mean something, was supposed to be part of a grand design leading humanity towards salvation. But if the Emperor actually wanted them to stop, if he'd been trying to tell them to abandon the Imperium and find a different path, then what were those deaths for? What was any of it for? No one had an answer. The question hung in the recycled air like smoke from an execution pyre. The tech priest, Metis, had been examining the walls, running blessed instruments across the alien script, muttering prayers to the machine god that felt increasingly hollow in this place. He turned to face them, his mechadendrites twitching with agitation, and announced something that made the situation impossibly worse. The station wasn't just a message. It was a beacon. The same coordinates that had drawn them here had been broadcasting into the warp for approximately 9,800 years, long before the Imperium even existed in its current form. Someone or something had known that humanity would build an empire around the Emperor's suffering, had known that eventually people would start questioning, had built this place as a trap or a test or possibly an offer, waiting for the right individuals to find it and make a choice that would reshape everything. Vex, ever practical, pointed out the obvious problem. They were 7 people on an ancient station in the Halo stars with information that would get them executed in the most creative ways the Inquisition could devise. Even if they wanted to do something with this knowledge, what could they possibly accomplish? The Imperium spanned 1,000,000 worlds. Its faith was burned into the souls of quadrillions of humans. The machinery of worship was self-sustaining now, feeding on itself, generating belief that powered the very thing the Emperor wanted to escape. How do you dismantle a religion when the religion has become the only thing holding civilization together? The former Space Marine, who insisted on being called only by his old squad designation, 9, spoke for the first time since they'd boarded the station. His voice was a rumble of ceramite and ceramite, a sound shaped by decades of warfare and neural conditioning that even his fall from grace couldn't erase. He said that the Imperium's faith wasn't holding civilization together. It was strangling it. Every world brought to compliance was a world stripped of its potential for growth. Every psyker fed to the throne was a human being murdered to sustain a lie. Every Space Marine chapter was a collection of warriors who could have been teachers, builders, leaders, instead molded into killers who knew nothing but war. The Emperor had created them to defend humanity, but the Imperium had turned them into humanity's jailers. 9 said that if the Emperor truly wanted to die, then maybe dying was the most loyal thing he could ask for. Maybe the greatest act of faith would be to grant him the peace he'd been denied for 10 millennia, regardless of what came after. Kade felt something shift in his chest, a sensation like armor plates settling into a new configuration. He'd spent 70 years enforcing Imperial doctrine, burning heretics, executing the unfaithful. And in all that time, he'd never once questioned whether he was serving the Emperor or just serving the machine built in his name. The distinction had seemed academic. But standing here, in this impossible place, with knowledge burning in his mind that the Inquisition had killed millions to suppress, the distinction was everything. The Emperor was not the Imperium. Imperium was not the Emperor. And somewhere in the 10,000 years between those two truths, humanity had lost its way so thoroughly that even recognizing the path back looked like treason. The navigator, Illa, had been silent throughout the discussion. Her third eye covered by a blessed cloth, her expression distant. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who'd seen beyond the veil of reality and returned diminished. She said the warp was changing, had been changing for centuries, but the shift was accelerating now. The Astronomicon still burned, still guided ships through the Imperium, but its light was flickering. It's not failing exactly, but transforming into something else. She'd felt it during their journey here, the way the currents moved around them, as if the warp itself was trying to show them something. As if whatever vast intelligence governed that realm of madness and nightmare was extending an offer. Let the Emperor die, and the warp would stabilize. Let him die, and humanity might finally break free of the cycle of endless war and suffering that had defined its existence since the day he sat upon the throne, but the cost would be immediate and catastrophic. Without the Astronomicon, without the Emperor's light guiding them, the Imperium would fragment. Worlds would be isolated. Billions would die in the chaos. And there was no guarantee that what emerged from the ruins would be better than what existed now. Kade looked at each of them in turn. These outcasts and heretics and truth-seekers who'd followed him into the darkness beyond Imperial space. He saw his own doubt reflected in their faces, his own desperate hope that maybe, somehow, there was a way forward that didn't require them to choose between loyalty to the Emperor and loyalty to everything the Imperium had become. But deep down, beneath the layers of training and conditioning and 70 years of unquestioning service, he knew there wasn't. The data packet in his mind made that clear. The Emperor had been making this choice for 10,000 years, choosing every day to keep fighting, keep suffering, keep screaming into the void, because ending his own existence would mean ending the Imperium. And the Emperor loved humanity too much to make that choice himself, even though it was killing him by inches, even though every day added another weight to a burden that had long since become unbearable. Someone else would have to make it for him. The realization hit Kade like a bolt shell to the chest. This wasn't just information, it was a test. The station, the beacon, the carefully preserved truth waiting here in the darkness, all of it was designed to find people capable of doing what the Emperor couldn't. People willing to kill their god to save him. People who loved humanity enough to damn themselves utterly and completely by giving the Imperium exactly what it would never forgive. The choice to let the light go out. Somewhere in the distance, far below them in the station's depths, something activated. A sound, like a heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing through kilometers of alien metal. The lights flickered, then stabilized into a different color, shifting from pale white to a deep gold that reminded Kade uncomfortably of the Golden Throne itself. And on every terminal throughout the command chamber, the same message appeared simultaneously in flawless High Gothic. Welcome, witnesses. You have been chosen. Now choose. The message didn't fade. It pulsed on the terminals with the rhythm of that distant heartbeat. Each word glowing brighter with every beat, as if the station itself had been waiting centuries just to speak those 4 sentences. Kade felt his team instinctively draw closer together, a defensive formation born from too many years of fighting things they didn't understand. But there was nothing to fight here. No enemy emerging from the shadows. Just the weight of a choice that felt like it might crush them all if they acknowledged it too directly. Metis approached the nearest terminal, his mechadendrites extending like cautious serpents testing dangerous ground. He touched the screen, and the moment his blessed metal made contact, the entire chamber shifted. Not physically, but in some way that transcended normal sensory perception. The walls became translucent, revealing not the void beyond, but something else entirely. Images, memories. Moments pulled from across 10,000 years of Imperial history, playing out in the alien metal-like windows into a past that refused to stay buried. They saw the Emperor walking among the ruins of old Earth, his face uncovered, looking unbearably human and unbearably sad as he surveyed the ashes of what humanity had been before the Age of Strife. They saw him in council with Malcador, arguing about something, their voices silent, but their body language speaking volumes. The Emperor kept gesturing outward, toward the stars, while Malcador kept pointing back toward Terra, toward humanity huddled in its cradle of ruins. A disagreement about destiny, about whether humanity needed a shepherd or needed to learn to walk alone. They saw the day he sat upon the Golden Throne. Not the mythologized version taught in every schola across the Imperium, but the actual moment, raw and unfiltered. The Emperor had been dying, yes, his body broken by Horus's betrayal. But his eyes had been clear, aware. And in those eyes was not acceptance, but protest. He'd tried to speak, tried to tell them something, but the throne's mechanisms were already activating, already pulling his consciousness away from his body, spreading it across the warp like a net meant to catch humanity every time it threatened to fall. The last word visible on his lips, repeated over and over as the throne consumed him, looked like it might have been no. Constance made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a scream. Her hand had left her bolter and was now pressed against her chest, over the aquila emblazoned on her armor. She said it couldn't be real, that the station was showing them lies, warp-tainted visions designed to break their faith, but her voice lacked conviction, because the visions felt true in a way that transcended proof or evidence. They felt like memories that humanity had collectively chosen to forget, because the truth was too painful to acknowledge. More images cascaded across the translucent walls. They saw the first black ships departing Terra, holds full of terrified psychers being brought to feed the throne. They saw the Emperor's consciousness reach out from within his prison, trying to stop them, trying to make them understand. But his thoughts were filtered through the Astronomicon, through the machinery of worship already calcifying around his suffering, and what emerged was just more golden light, just more divine guidance that the Imperium interpreted as approval for its atrocities. They saw Guilliman, returned from death, standing before the golden throne for the first time in 10,000 years. They couldn't hear what the Emperor said to his son, but they saw Guilliman's face afterward, saw the Primarch walk away, looking like a man who'd just learned that everything he'd spent centuries building was exactly wrong. They saw him nearly break, nearly tell his gathered forces the truth, and then watch as his own pragmatism won out. Because what good would truth do in an Imperium so far gone that truth itself had become the most dangerous heresy? Nine moved closer to the walls, his enhanced eyes tracking details the others might have missed. He pointed out something that made Kade's blood run cold. In every vision, lurking at the edges, there were figures watching. Not demons, not aliens, just humans, inquisitors, high lords, cardinals of the ecclesiarchy, people who knew, who had always known, who had access to the same truths Kade had stumbled upon and had consciously, deliberately chosen to bury them deeper. The Imperium's leadership wasn't ignorant of the Emperor's true desires. They were actively suppressing them, generation after generation, because a dying god was more useful than a dead one, and infinitely more useful than one allowed to achieve whatever transformation the throne had interrupted. The visions shifted again, showing them something that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps something that was happening right now, in the materium they'd left behind. They saw inquisitorial fleets moving through the void, saw orders being transmitted across astropathic channels with highest priority encryption. Someone had noticed Kade's disappearance, someone had connected it to the Whisper Protocol cases, and someone had made the decision that whatever he'd gone looking for needed to be eliminated so thoroughly that even its absence would be forgotten. The fleets were heading toward the halo stars, toward these coordinates. They had maybe days before overwhelming force arrived to ensure this station and everyone on it ceased to exist. Vex swore in 3 different languages, each one more colorful than the last. He'd known their window was limited, but he'd expected months, not days. The Imperium didn't move that fast unless something had terrified it at the highest levels, which meant someone very powerful was watching the Whisper Protocol cases more closely than anyone had realized, someone who'd been waiting for exactly this scenario. For someone to finally follow the breadcrumb trail all the way to its source, Illa spoke up. Her voice strained in a way that suggested her third eye was seeing things even through its blessed covering. She said the warp was churning, responding to something, to their presence here, or to the fleets approaching, or possibly to the simple fact that 7 people now existed in real space with knowledge that could crack the foundation of Imperial faith. She could feel pressure building in the immaterium, vast forces gathering like storm clouds before a hurricane. The Chaos Gods were interested now, watching these proceedings with attention that felt like the gaze of a starving predator. Because if the Emperor died, if his light finally went out, the resulting chaos wouldn't just fragment the Imperium. It would reshape the entire warp. New gods might be born from the psychic shockwave. Old gods might finally break through barriers that the Emperor's existence had reinforced for 10 millennia. Or possibly, just possibly, something entirely unexpected might emerge. Something that neither the Imperium nor the ruinous powers had accounted for. Silas dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against his temples, blood beginning to leak from his nose. The voice he'd been hearing for 3 years was screaming now, not in pain but in urgency, trying to communicate something that human consciousness wasn't equipped to process. He gasped out fragments. Words that didn't quite connect but painted a picture nonetheless. The Emperor was aware of them, aware of this moment, aware that for the first time in 10,000 years, someone existed with both the knowledge and the capability to actually grant his wish. And he was terrified, not of death, but of what his death might cost. Because the Emperor had never stopped loving humanity, had never stopped trying to protect it even from inside his cage of gold and faith and endless suffering. Letting go meant trusting that humanity could survive what came next. And after 10,000 years of watching humanity prove again and again that it needed supervision, needed guidance, needed someone to blame and someone to pray to and someone to justify every monstrous act committed in the name of survival, that trust felt like the cruelest form of hope. The heartbeat sound grew louder, more insistent. Now they could feel it through the floor, through their bones, through the modified tissue and augmetics and psychically attuned nerve endings that marked them all as something more or less than baseline human. The station was preparing for something. Deep in its ancient mechanisms, power was building, systems activating that hadn't functioned since before humanity learned to split the atom. Its instruments were screaming warnings in binaric cant, but he ignored them, too focused on the terminal he'd touched. Information was flowing into his augmented consciousness now, schematics and calculations and terrible, beautiful possibilities. He spoke in a monotone that suggested he was relaying information faster than his organic brain could fully process it. The station, he said, was a weapon. Not in the conventional sense, but in the way that knowledge itself could be weaponized. It had been built by someone or something that understood the warp far better than humanity ever had. Possibly one of the ancient civilizations that had risen and fallen during humanity's infancy. Its purpose was simple and horrifying. It could sever the connection between the Golden Throne and the Imperium, could cut the Emperor free from his prison without killing him directly, but without the throne's machinery forcing his consciousness to remain coherent, he would finally be allowed to dissolve, to transform, to become whatever he was supposed to become before Horus had struck him down and the Imperium had locked him in stasis. The cost would be exactly what they'd already discussed. Immediate collapse of the Astronomicon, fragmentation of the Imperium, billions dead in the chaos. But potentially, eventually, possibly, a humanity finally free to evolve beyond the endless cycle of warfare and suffering that had defined it for 10 millennia. Constance found her voice again. This time it carried the full weight of her conditioning, her faith, her absolute certainty that duty mattered more than comfort. She said they couldn't do it, said that even if the Emperor wanted to die, even if he'd been screaming for release for 10,000 years, they didn't have the right to make that choice for him. Didn't have the right to condemn billions to death just to ease one man's suffering, even if that man was a god. She said the Imperium was terrible, yes, but it was all that stood between humanity and extinction. Without it, without the structure and faith and brutal discipline that kept a million worlds unified against the darkness, humanity would be consumed within a generation. The Imperium wasn't a mistake. It was humanity's only hope for survival in a galaxy designed to kill them. Nine's response was quiet but carried across the chamber like thunder. He asked her how many generations the Imperium needed. How many more centuries of grinding warfare and casual genocide before humanity was allowed to try something different? He asked her if she'd ever wondered why the Emperor's vision of the future, the secular imperial truth he'd tried to build before Horus's betrayal, looked nothing like the theocratic nightmare the Imperium had become. Asked her if she thought he'd wanted to be worshipped, wanted to be turned into a god while his body rotted on a throne built from his children's failure. The argument spiraled, voices rising, old certainties clashing against new truths that neither side wanted to fully acknowledge. Kade watched them fight, knowing he should intervene, knowing he should assert authority as the ranking Inquisitor, but finding himself paralyzed by the same doubts tearing his team apart, because both sides were right. Constance was right that triggering the station would doom billions. Nine was right that the Imperium was a perversion of everything the Emperor had tried to build. And they were both wrong, because neither answer accounted for the impossible complexity of 10,000 years of history and faith and accumulated human suffering that couldn't be reduced to simple moral calculations. The terminal metis was connected to flashed a new message. Time remaining until fleet arrival, 47 hours. Time required to activate station, 3 hours. Choice required immediately. Kade felt the weight of 70 years of service, of every execution order signed, every world burned, every heretic screaming truth as they died, all of it pressing down on him like a physical force. He was an Inquisitor. His entire existence was predicated on the idea that the Imperium was worth preserving at any cost, that faith in the Emperor justified any atrocity, that humanity needed a shepherd, even if that shepherd was a corpse god slowly dying on a golden throne. But standing here with the Emperor's own desires laid bare before him, with proof that every prayer was another chain binding a suffering demigod to an existence he'd never wanted, Kade found himself asking a question that should have been answered 10,000 years ago. What did humanity owe the Emperor? Obedience or mercy? Kade raised his hand, silencing the argument that had begun to fracture his team into opposing camps. The gesture was simple, but carried authority earned through decades of command, of making decisions that meant life or death for millions. But this decision felt different, heavier, as if the weight of every choice he'd ever made had been practiced for this single moment. He told them they were asking the wrong question. The issue wasn't whether they had the right to activate the station. The issue was whether anyone had the right to force the Emperor to continue suffering just because his suffering had become convenient. Constance started to respond, but Kade cut her off, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. He said he'd spent 70 years burning people for heresy, for questioning imperial doctrine, for daring to suggest that maybe there was a better way. He'd watched children die. He'd ordered the execution of entire bloodlines based on the possibility of corruption. He told himself every single time that it was necessary, that the Emperor's will demanded it, that faith required sacrifice. But standing here with actual evidence of what the Emperor truly wanted, he finally understood what real faith looked like. It wasn't blind obedience. It was having the courage to give someone you love what they need, even when it destroys you to do it. 9 moved to stand beside Kade, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A fallen space marine and an Inquisitor, natural enemies by every definition that mattered in the Imperium, united in a choice that would brand them both as the worst kind of traitors. 9 said that space marines were created to serve humanity, not the Imperium. That distinction had been beaten out of them over 10,000 years of indoctrination, but it still mattered. The Emperor made them to protect humans, to give humanity time to grow strong enough to stand alone. Somewhere along the way, that mission had been perverted into endless warfare for its own sake. Maybe it was time to remember what they were actually supposed to be doing. Vex surprised everyone by speaking up in support, though his reasoning was characteristically pragmatic. He said he'd traveled to the edges of Imperial space and beyond. He'd seen human worlds that thrived without the Imperium's crushing bureaucracy and religious fanaticism. They weren't paradise, but they weren't the hell the Imperium claimed awaited anyone who rejected the Emperor's light. Humanity was more resilient than the Imperium gave it credit for. Maybe fragmenting wasn't the end. Maybe it was an opportunity for 1,000 different versions of human civilization to emerge, to experiment, to find solutions that centralized dogma could never allow. Illa closed her third eye completely, letting the blessed cloth fall away. The act was deeply symbolic for a navigator, a gesture of surrendering the gift that defined her entire bloodline. She said she'd been navigating the warp for 40 years, and in all that time, the Astronomicon had felt like a leash as much as a guide. It kept ships moving in the right direction, yes, but it also ensured they never strayed too far from the paths the Imperium approved. She'd felt currents in the warp that could have taken them to places beyond Imperial reach, 2 human civilizations that had survived old night through different means. But the Astronomicon's pull made those currents impossible to follow. Maybe losing that light wouldn't be the catastrophe everyone assumed. Maybe it would finally allow humanity to explore the full breadth of what it could become. Silas looked up from his position on the floor, blood still leaking from his nose, but his eyes suddenly clear in a way they hadn't been since Kade had recruited him. He said the voice had stopped screaming, was just whispering now, sad, hopeful, terrified, grateful. All of those emotions mixed together in a way that suggested the Emperor was listening to this conversation, watching these 7 broken pieces of his Imperium debate his fate, and finding in their words something he'd been searching for across 10 millennia. Permission. Not from the High Lords or the Ecclesiarchy or the countless institutions that profited from his imprisonment. Permission from people who actually understood what they were freeing him from, and loved him enough to accept the consequences. Only Constance remained opposed, standing rigid in her armor. Her hand now gripping her bolter so tightly the weapon's casing was beginning to crack under the pressure. She said she understood their reasoning, said she might even agree with parts of it, but her conditioning went deeper than logic or compassion. She'd been shaped since childhood to view service to the Imperium as the highest calling. Every sister in her convent had died fighting enemies of mankind. Their sacrifice meant something, had to mean something. If they activated the station, if they let the Emperor die, then what were those deaths for? What meaning could be salvaged from an ocean of blood spilled in the name of a lie? Kade approached her slowly, hands spread to show he meant no threat. He told her that the deaths wouldn't become meaningless. Every person who'd sacrificed themselves believing in the Emperor's vision had been acting on real faith, a real hope for humanity's future. The fact that the Imperium had corrupted that vision didn't invalidate their sacrifice. It made it more important, because if they did nothing, if they walked away from this station and let things continue as they were, then the sacrifice would never end. The Imperium would keep grinding souls into dust, keep feeding them to a machine that its own creator wanted destroyed, keep building monuments to suffering and calling them holy. The only way to honor the dead was to give meaning to their deaths by ensuring their children didn't have to die the same way. Tears were running down Constance's face now, cutting tracks through the sacred oils she'd anointed herself with that morning. She asked him what she was supposed to do. How was she supposed to live knowing she'd helped kill the Emperor? How was she supposed to face her sisters, her faith? The billion humans across the galaxy who drew comfort from believing in his divine protection? Kade told her she wouldn't have to face any of them, because there was no walking away from this choice. The moment they activated the station, they were dead. The inquisitorial fleets would arrive and find this place empty of life, its purpose fulfilled, and they would erase everything. No witnesses, no records, no names to condemn. Just 7 people who loved humanity enough to damn themselves utterly, so that maybe, eventually, humanity might be free. The silence that followed stretched until it felt like reality itself was holding its breath. Then Mita spoke, his voice modulated to something almost gentle, despite its mechanical distortion. He said the station was offering them a final option. Its activation didn't require all of them. One person could trigger the mechanism while the others escaped in their ship. Return to Imperial space with whatever story they could fabricate to explain their absence. One person could bear the weight of this choice alone, could die knowing they'd freed the Emperor, but spared their companions from sharing the condemnation. The station was even providing specific instructions, a sequence of actions that would take approximately 2 hours to complete, leaving just enough time for the others to reach minimum safe distance before the effect cascaded across the warp. Kade knew immediately that he would be that person, could see in the others' faces that they'd reached the same conclusion. He was the Inquisitor, the one who'd led them here, the one whose 70 years of service had earned him the right to this final act of penance. But Nine shook his head, his scarred face set in lines of absolute determination. He said that Inquisitors were needed in the Imperium that would come after, people with authority and knowledge capable of managing the transition, of preventing total collapse, of ensuring that the Emperor's sacrifice wasn't wasted on immediate anarchy. But Space Marines? Space Marines were weapons, and weapons didn't need to survive the final battle. The argument that erupted was fierce, but brief. Each of them tried to volunteer, tried to claim the right to this last sacrifice. And in their desperation to shoulder the burden alone, they revealed exactly how much they'd changed since entering the Halo Stars. These weren't servants of the Imperium anymore. They were something the Imperium had spent 10,000 years trying to prevent. They were people who'd learned to think for themselves, to question authority, to value truth over comfort. They were, in every way that mattered, exactly what the Emperor had wanted humanity to become. Kade made the decision before anyone could argue further. He drew his plasma pistol, set it to overload, and aimed it at the ship's command console visible through the transparent walls. He told them this wasn't a negotiation. They had 5 minutes to get to the ship and initiate launch procedures before he destroyed their means of escape. If they refused to leave him behind, he'd ensure they all died together when the inquisitorial fleets arrived. It was the only threat that would work, and they all knew it. Pragmatism won out over sentiment. They left one by one, each stopping to say something that felt inadequate against the magnitude of what was happening. Constance embraced him, whispering a prayer that wasn't from any approved liturgy, something older and more personal. Vex pressed a data slate into his hands containing coordinates for human worlds beyond Imperial reach, places where the Imperium's collapse might not mean extinction. Illa touched his forehead with hers, a navigator's blessing, wishing him clear sight in whatever came next. Silas just smiled, the expression heartbreaking in its simple gratitude. Matisse transferred a final piece of code to Kade's neural implants, something that would make the activation process easier, less painful. Nine clasped his arm in the grip of warriors who'd fought side by side, though they never had, and told him that the Emperor would remember this. Someone would remember. Then they were gone, their footsteps echoing away down the alien corridors, and Kade was alone with his choice. He approached the central terminal, where instructions had appeared in High Gothic, so pure it might have been the language's original form. The process was simple, but would require his active participation for 2 hours. His consciousness linked directly to the station's systems, his own life force used as a catalyst to power mechanisms that had been dormant since before humanity knew fire. He would feel everything, would experience the severing of the connection between the throne and the warp, would sense the Emperor's consciousness finally unshackling itself, fragmenting or transforming or simply ending, depending on what happened when a demigod was finally allowed to choose his own fate. Kade placed his hands on the terminal. The connection was immediate and agonizing. His nervous system became an extension of the station's power grid. His thoughts suddenly scattered across light years of empty space, his perception expanding until he could sense Terra itself, could feel the golden throne humming with trapped potential, could almost hear the Emperor's voice rising from beneath centuries of mechanical prayer and human desperation. The voice was asking him a question, not in words, but in pure meaning, transmitted directly into his fragmenting consciousness. Are you certain? Do you understand what you're offering me? What it will cost your species? Kade thought his answer, with every fragment of awareness he could still gather. Yes, yes, and yes. He was offering mercy, offering the freedom to transform, or die, or simply rest after 10,000 years of enforced suffering. Offering what any being deserved after spending millennia trying to warn its children that they were building there. Salvation on the foundation of his torment. The cost to humanity would be terrible. But the cost of continuing to chain a dying god to existence against his will was worse, even if humanity couldn't see it yet. Even if they would hate Kade for this choice, until the last human died on the last world as the universe wound down toward heat death. The Emperor's response flooded through him like golden light mixed with ancient sorrow. Thank you, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what comes next. But thank you for finally letting me go. The station began to sing. The singing wasn't sound, not in any conventional sense. It was vibration that existed in dimensions human senses weren't designed to perceive, rippling outward from the station in waves that touched the warp and the materium simultaneously. Kade felt it moving through him, rewriting the fundamental constants that governed his existence. And distantly, through the link that was slowly dissolving his individual consciousness into something larger, he sensed the effect reaching Terra, reaching the Golden Throne, reaching the Emperor. For 10,000 years, the throne had functioned as both prison and life support, forcing the Emperor's consciousness to remain coherent, spread across the immaterium like a vast net, catching humanity every time it stumbled. Now that net was being cut, strand by strand, each severance releasing a fragment of awareness that had been locked in stasis since the day Horus had struck him down. The Emperor wasn't dying, not exactly. He was finally being allowed to complete a transformation that had been interrupted at the moment of his greatest vulnerability. What he was becoming, Kade couldn't comprehend, but he could sense its shape, vast and strange and utterly unlike anything the Imperium had built its faith around. Through Kade's fragmenting awareness, he felt the moment the Astronomicon flickered, felt the panic that erupted across 1,000,000 worlds as the light that had guided them for 10 millennia suddenly became unreliable, stuttering like a candle in a storm. Ships in the warp found themselves adrift, their navigators screaming as the beacon they'd relied on began to fade. Entire sectors went dark. Communication broke down. The carefully maintained illusion of imperial unity started to crack, revealing the truth beneath. That humanity had never been as united as it pretended. That the Imperium was held together not by faith or loyalty, but by the simple fact that everyone was too terrified of the alternative to imagine anything different. But through the chaos, through the fear and confusion and rising panic, Kade sensed something else, something the Imperium had never allowed itself to consider: humanity adapting. Not all at once, not cleanly, but with the desperate resourcefulness that had allowed them to survive everything the galaxy had thrown at them across 40,000 years of recorded history. Worlds that had always relied on Terra's guidance began making their own decisions, forming their own alliances, choosing their own paths. Some fell into darkness and madness, yes. Some were consumed by xenos or chaos or simple human cruelty. But others, more than the Imperium had ever wanted to admit, began to thrive. To build something new from the ruins of imposed faith. To remember that humanity had survived Old Night once before and might survive this second-long darkness if it learned to trust itself instead of a god who'd never wanted to be worshipped. Kade felt his physical body begin to fail, cells breaking down under the strain of channeling power that mortal flesh was never meant to contain. But the pain was distant now, muted by the overwhelming sense of purpose that flooded through the link connecting him to the station. To the Emperor, to the choice that was reshaping reality across light years of space. He thought about his 70 years of service, all the people he'd killed, all the worlds he'd burned, all the suffering he'd caused in the name of preserving an empire that its own creator had wanted to transcend. He couldn't undo those actions. Couldn't bring back the dead or erase the scars he'd left across the face of human civilization, but he could offer this. One act of defiance against the machinery of faith that had corrupted everything the Emperor tried to build. One moment where someone finally listened to what their god was actually saying, instead of what they wanted to hear. The Emperor's presence withdrew from Kade's mind gradually, like a father reluctantly letting go of a child's hand. In that final moment of contact, Kade understood something that would have been heresy to speak aloud in any imperial court. The Emperor had never been perfect, had never been the flawless golden god that 10,000 years of worship had made him. He'd been a man, impossibly powerful and impossibly old, but still just a man who'd made terrible mistakes in pursuit of a vision he couldn't quite articulate to beings who existed on a fundamentally different scale of time and power. He'd created the Space Marines knowing they would become weapons that could never fully return to civilian life. He'd unified Terra through conquest and called it enlightenment. He'd tried to build a secular empire while wielding power that humanity couldn't help but view as divine. And when everything fell apart, when Horus betrayed him and the dream shattered, he'd let himself be imprisoned because he was too afraid that his death would doom the species he'd spent millennia trying to save. But fear, even fear born from love, couldn't justify 10,000 years of suffering. Couldn't justify an empire built on the systematic murder of psychers to fuel a machine that should never have existed in the first place. Couldn't justify the endless cycles of warfare and oppression and brutal enforcement of dogma that had turned humanity into exactly the kind of stagnant, cruel civilization the Emperor had supposedly been trying to prevent. Sometimes love meant letting go. Meant trusting that the ones you'd tried to protect could find their own way, even if that path led through darkness you couldn't see the end of. The Emperor had finally learned that lesson, and it had taken a burned-out Inquisitor from a forgotten world to teach him. Kade's vision was fading now, his body cooling as the last of his life was drawn into the station's mechanisms. Through the transparent walls, he could see his ship in the distance, a tiny speck of light accelerating away from the coordinates that would soon cease to exist. The inquisitorial fleets were close now, maybe an hour out, their commanders certain they were racing to prevent catastrophe. They had no idea they were already too late, that the damage or the salvation, depending on one's perspective, was already done. The Emperor was free. The Astronomicon was dying, and across 1,000,000 worlds, humanity was about to learn what it meant to stand alone. His last coherent thought was a question that would never be answered, not by him, not in any lifetime he could imagine. Had he done the right thing? Had he saved humanity or condemned it? Had he honored the Emperor or betrayed everything the Imperium stood for? The answer, he realized in the final seconds before his consciousness dissolved entirely, didn't matter. Because right and wrong were luxuries for people who had the time to contemplate them. He'd had only the choice itself, the terrible freedom of deciding between two futures he couldn't fully predict, and he'd chosen the one that felt like mercy. Whether mercy was what humanity needed or what it deserved would be determined by what came next, by whether the species could grow beyond its need for a god to blame and a god to worship, by whether 10,000 years of enforced unity had prepared them for the hardest test of all, learning to trust themselves. The station sang its final note, and Erasmus Kade, Lord Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus, faithful servant of an emperor he'd finally learned to love by letting him go, ceased to exist as anything more than energy flowing through ancient mechanisms. Built by civilizations that understood endings were also beginnings, the ship, carrying his 6 companions, emerged from the warp 3 weeks later, their chronometers insisting only 5 days had passed. Near a world at the edge of Imperial space that was just beginning to realize Terra's light had gone out, they said nothing about what they'd witnessed, made no grand declarations, just quietly dispersed into a galaxy that was fracturing into 1,000 different possible futures, each carrying the knowledge that they'd helped murder a god to save him, that they'd destroyed an empire to fulfill its founder's vision, they'd committed the greatest heresy imaginable and called it faith. In the centuries that followed, as the Imperium slowly collapsed and reformed and splintered into countless successor states, while some brutal and some enlightened and most somewhere muddily between, stories began to spread. Whispers, really nothing concrete enough to be called heresy, but too persistent to be fully suppressed. Stories about the Emperor's final message, delivered not through the ecclesiarchy or the High Lords, but through the minds of those who'd fallen so far from imperial doctrine they could finally hear clearly. Stories about a station beyond the halo stars where truth waited for anyone brave enough to seek it. Stories about 7 people who'd loved humanity enough to set it free, even knowing freedom meant chaos and suffering and the death of every comfortable certainty the Imperium had provided. The Inquisition still hunts those who listen too carefully to these stories, still burns recordings and executes witnesses, and maintains the fiction that the Emperor's imprisonment was his will rather than humanity's failure. But the whispers don't stop, because truth, once spoken, can never be fully silenced. It finds cracks in every wall, roots in every foundation, and grows until even the most carefully maintained lie begins to crumble under its weight. Perhaps that's what the Fallen were trying to say all along. Not that the Emperor wanted to die, but that humanity needed to learn how to live without him, needed to grow up, make its own mistakes, build its own futures without a 10,000-year-old corpse making decisions it could no longer understand. Perhaps the greatest act of faith isn't blind obedience, but the courage to question, the strength to let go, the wisdom to understand that sometimes the most loyal thing you can do for someone you love is give them permission to rest. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is more than war. There is also hope, fragile and uncertain, that perhaps humanity can become something other than what it's been. Something the Emperor might have recognized if he'd lived to see it. Something worth the terrible price of freedom. But only time will tell if mercy was salvation or damnation. Only the slow turning of centuries will reveal whether 7 heretics destroyed humanity's future or finally allowed it to begin. And in the darkness between stars, where failed empires leave their bones for others to study, perhaps the Emperor himself watches, is no longer bound by flesh or faith, and wonders if his children will prove him right. If they'll rise from the ashes of his dream and build something better, or if they'll spend another 10,000 years searching for someone to worship, someone to blame, someone to save them from the hardest truth of all, that salvation was always theirs to claim. They just had to be brave enough to reach for it. If this journey through the shadows of the Imperium made you question what faith truly means, what loyalty demands, what truth costs, then share this story with others who dare to ask difficult questions. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And remember, in a universe of endless war, sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to listen when the Fallen whisper their warnings from beyond death.